This story is titled, My Fiancé Threatened to Cancel the Wedding Unless I Sent My Kids to Boarding School to Move in Her Brother, so I canceled the wedding instead. Hi everyone! Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and make sure you never miss out on amazing videos. Alright, let's get started. Hey guys, I need to get something off my chest, and honestly, I could use some perspective. I'm a 38-year-old single dad with two kids, ages 10 and 12. Their mom passed away a few years ago, and since then, it's been just the three of us. Life hasn't always been smooth, but I think we've done a good job holding things together. My kids are great. They're kind, smart, and resilient, and they've been my biggest motivation to keep pushing forward. Anyway, about a year and a half ago, I met someone. Let's call her Sarah. She's 34, and we met through mutual friends at a barbecue. At first, she seemed like everything I'd been hoping for. She was outgoing, charming, and had this spark that drew people in. We hit it off right away, and soon enough, we were dating. Sarah made an effort to get to know my kids early on, which I appreciate. She'd take them out for ice cream or to the park, and she was always trying to engage with them. My kids were polite around her, but I could tell they were holding back a little. Maybe it was because they'd been through so much already, and they were wary of getting too attached to someone new. I figured that was normal, though. These things take time, right? At first, everything felt great. Sarah seemed to understand that my kids were my world and that we were a package. She'd talk about how she admired my parenting and how much she wanted to be part of our lives. It felt good to have someone in my corner who seemed to get it. Over time, our relationship got more serious. Sarah and I started spending more time together, and she even began staying over at my house sometimes. My kids were fine with it. They didn't seem overly excited, but they weren't against it either. I thought we were all adjusting well to the idea of blending our lives. But there were little things that, looking back now, probably should have been red flags. For one, Sarah started making comments about the house. She'd say things like, "It's cozy, but maybe we could modernize it a bit." Or, "The kids' rooms are cute, but wouldn't it be fun to give them a makeover?" At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured she just wanted to put her own touch on the place, and I was okay with that. Another thing was how she'd talk about our future. She'd make these comments about how we could build a life together, travel, and maybe even have a kid of our own someday. I wasn't against any of that in theory, but I always made it clear that my priority was my kids. She'd smile and nod, but now that I think about it, I'm not sure she really got it. Then there was her family, specifically her brother Jake. He came up in conversations occasionally, but not in a good way. Jake was apparently going through a rough patch. Sarah mentioned that he'd lost his job, was struggling to get back on his feet, and had been staying with their parents. She talked about him like he was a lost cause, but also like it was everyone else's responsibility to help him. I didn't think much of it at first. We all have family members who need a little extra support sometimes, and I figured it wasn't my place to judge. But as I got to know Sarah better, I started to realize just how much of a mess Jake really was. He couldn't hold down a job, he made terrible decisions, and he seemed to have zero motivation to change. Still, none of this felt like a deal breaker at the time. Sarah and I were getting closer, and I was starting to think about our future together. I'd been on my own for so long, and it felt nice to imagine having a partner again. About a year into our relationship, I started thinking seriously about proposing. Sarah had been dropping hints for a while, showing me pictures of rings she liked, talking about wedding venues, that kind of thing. I wasn't blind to it, and honestly, I thought it was a good idea. My kids were doing well in school, we had a stable routine, and I felt like I was ready to take that next step. I knew it wouldn't be easy blending our lives completely, but I believed we could make it work. I planned a simple, meaningful proposal at the park, where we had one of our first dates. No big spectacle, just something genuine. On the day, I was nervous, but excited. As we walked, I told her how much she meant to me, then pulled out the ring and asked her to marry me. She said yes, ecstatic as she slipped on the ring, already dreaming about wedding plans and our future together. In that moment, everything felt perfect. I had no idea how quickly it would all fall apart. The first couple of weeks after the proposal felt like a whirlwind of excitement. Sarah dove headfirst into wedding planning, picking out color schemes, browsing venues, and flipping through Pinterest boards like it was her full-time job. I was just trying to keep up. Between work, taking care of the kids, and managing everything else, I let her take the lead on the wedding details. She seemed thrilled, and I didn't want to dim that. But as time went on, little things started to creep in that didn't sit right with me. At first, it was small comments here and there, like how the house needed a woman's touch, or how she envisioned our future being more polished. I didn't really know what she meant by polished, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was her way of saying she wanted to contribute, or make the space feel like hers too. Then she started making suggestions, subtle ones at first. Wouldn't it be nice to clear out some of the kids' old stuff? You know, give the house a more open vibe? Or maybe we could move some of their things to the garage to keep the rooms tidier? On their own, these comments didn't seem like a big deal, but when you added them up, it felt like she was trying to erase parts of the home we'd built. I didn't say much at the time, though. I figured she was just excited about the idea of us building a life together, and maybe I was overthinking it. But then came the furniture. One Saturday morning, Sarah showed up with a catalog and a plan to upgrade the living room. I wasn't even sure what needed upgrading. The couch was fine, the coffee table was sturdy, and the kids' beanbags in the corner were non-negotiable. She went on about how she wanted the space to feel more adult and less chaotic. I had to bite my tongue to keep from snapping. This was a family home, not some magazine spread. The first real clash came when she suggested turning the spare room, which doubled as a study and craft space for the kids, into a guest room. She called it a compromise because it would still be available for the kids to use sometimes. That room was more than just a space. It was where the kids did their art projects, where I worked late at night when they were asleep, and honestly, it was one of the few parts of the house that felt like ours. I told her we weren't changing it. She didn't argue outright, but I could see the irritation on her face. She made a passive-aggressive comment about how we'd have to figure out how to make space for everyone eventually, and I let it drop. Around this time, Jake started showing up in more of her conversation. He was apparently staying with her parents, but according to Sarah, it was a temporary thing. She mentioned him needing support and how it was hard for her to see him struggle. I didn't really respond to that because I didn't know what to say. Jake wasn't my responsibility, and I was already juggling enough. Then came the day she asked if Jake could come over for dinner. She said he wanted to get to know me and the kids better since we were all going to be family soon. I agreed, to be honest. I was curious about him. The dinner was awkward. Jake showed up late, reeked of bad decisions, and spent most of the night complaining about how hard life was for him. He barely acknowledged the kids, who had been excited to meet him, and only really spoke to Sarah. I tried to make small talk, but it felt like pulling teeth. After he left, Sarah gushed about how great it was that we'd all gotten together. I didn't know what dinner she'd been at, but it wasn't the one I just endured. I told her Jake seemed like he was going through a lot, and she immediately got defensive, saying he just needed a chance to turn things around. I let it drop again, but something about the way she jumped to his defense didn't sit right with me. A couple of weeks later, Sarah started mentioning Jake more frequently. She said her parents were pressuring her to help him out, and how she felt torn between her family and her future with me. I could tell she was fishing for something, but I wasn't about to bite. That's when the requests started getting bolder. She floated the idea of Jake staying with us for a little while after the wedding. I told her I wasn't comfortable with that, but she wouldn't let it go. She said it would just be temporary and that he'd stay out of the way. I asked where he'd stay, and she casually suggested the spare room. I reminded her that it was the kids' space, and she brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. The conversation didn't go anywhere, but it left a bad taste in my mouth. Around this time, I also noticed a change in how Sarah interacted with the kids. She started asking them questions about school and their routine, which seemed harmless at first, but then she started making these weird comments about how they'd benefit from structure, or how they might enjoy a new environment. One day, my son asked me what a boarding school was. I froze. I asked him where he'd heard about that, and he said Sarah mentioned it. That was a moment where the alarm bells in my head went off full blast. When I brought it up to Sarah, she laughed it off and said she was just talking about how boarding schools have great programs for kids. She said it was an innocent conversation, but I wasn't so sure. I told her I didn't want her planting ideas like that in their heads, and she got defensive, saying she was just trying to help. At this point, the cracks in our relationship were starting to feel impossible to ignore. Sarah's focus seemed less on building a life with us, and more on bending our life to fit her vision. And I was starting to feel like I wasn't just blending a family, I was being steamrolled into making concessions I wasn't comfortable with. After Sarah and I had that tense conversation about her mentioning boarding school to my son, I thought we'd moved past it. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, maybe her way of trying to connect with the kids in her own awkward way. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt because, at the time, I still believed we were working toward the same future. But as the days passed, the pieces started falling into place, and it wasn't pretty. And I had no idea how far she was planning to take things until one evening when she sat me down and laid it all out. It started like any other evening. The kids were upstairs finishing homework, and I was trying to relax on the couch after a long day. Sarah walked in with a determined look on her face, the kind of expression that told me whatever she was about to say, I probably wasn't going to like it. She sat down across from me. "We need to talk," she began. I sighed. "All right, what's on your mind?" She hesitated for a moment, which wasn't like her. Sarah usually didn't hold back when she wanted something. I've been thinking a lot about how we're going to make this work once we're married, she said carefully. Okay, I said, already bracing myself. It's about the house, she continued. I don't think it's going to work the way it is now. Not with all of us here. I frowned. What do you mean? We're doing fine as it is. She shook her head, giving me a look like I was missing something obvious. No, we're not. This house is too small for all of us to live comfortably. We're going to have to make some changes. I could feel my patience slipping already. Sarah, the kids have their rooms. I've got my office/spare room. It's not perfect, but it works. What kind of changes are you talking about? That's when she dropped the bomb. I think we should consider sending the kids to boarding school. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said, remembering my kids bringing that up too. Boarding school? Are you serious? Yes, I'm serious, she said, her tone firm. I've been looking into it, and there are some incredible programs out there. They'd get a top-tier education, meet new friends, and learn independence. It's a great opportunity for them. And what's the real reason you're suggesting this? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Because this feels less about the kids and more about something else. She hesitated again, but only for a moment. Fine, she said, her voice sharpening. If the kids went to boarding school, it would free up space here. Jake could move in and have a proper room. He needs stability. And this is the best way to make that happen. There it was. The real reason. I shook my head, anger bubbling up. You want me to send my kids away so your grown, drunk, unemployed brother can have a room in their house? Are you even hearing yourself right now? She sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. Jake's in a bad place right now. He needs help, and this would give him a fresh start. It's not just about him. It's about us building a future together. We have to think about what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? I repeated, my voice rising. Sarah, what's best for my kids is staying in their home, with their friends, their routine, and their dad. Not being shipped off so your brother can move in. Her expression hardened. You're being so short-sighted, she snapped. You're not even willing to consider what boarding school could offer them. It's not like I'm suggesting something bad. They'd get an amazing education, and we'd have the space we need to start fresh. I don't need a fresh start, I said firmly. My kids don't need a fresh start. They need stability, something they've barely had since their mom died. And I'm not about to throw that away because Jake can't get his act together. Her face twisted in frustration. Why are you being so difficult about this? Jake is family. He needs us. Isn't that what families are supposed to do? Help each other? Jake is your family, I corrected her. My family is upstairs, doing homework, in a house that's supposed to be their safe space. You don't get to come in here and decide their lives are less important than your brother's comfort. That seemed to strike a nerve. Her tone shifted from defensive to outright hostile. You're acting like I'm trying to hurt them, she said, her voice sharp. I'm not. I'm trying to create a life where we all have room to breathe. But you're so stuck in your ways that you can't see how good this could be for everyone. This isn't about what's good for everyone, I shot back. This is about you trying to push my kids out of their own home to make room for your brother. That's not happening, Sarah. Not now, not ever. She stood up abruptly, crossing her arms. Fine, she said, trying to control herself from throwing a tantrum as she always does. If you're not willing to even consider this, then maybe we need to rethink everything. I stood up too, meeting her glare. What's that supposed to mean? It means, she said slowly, that if you can't put my family first for once, then maybe this isn't going to work. I'm not marrying someone who doesn't respect my family. I stared at her, completely stunned. Respect your family? You want to talk about respect? What about respecting my kids? My family? She didn't flinch. This is your choice, she said, repeating her ultimatum. Either you choose me or your kids, your call, and I won't settle for less. She walked out of the room after that, leaving me standing there in silence. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd known for weeks that something was off, but this was a whole other level. For the first time since I'd proposed to Sarah, I started to wonder if I'd made a huge mistake. The tension in the house had been building for weeks. Every time Sarah brought up Jake, it felt like we were headed for another argument. Then Jake showed up unannounced, and I was outright disgusted. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. How could someone be so shameless, so utterly clueless, that they couldn't grasp a basic fact? You don't just barge into someone else's life expecting a free ride. His recklessness wasn't just baffling, it was repulsive. This wasn't even the first time Jake had shown up unannounced at my place. But after everything that had happened recently, I had zero patience left for his antics. It was a Saturday morning when it happened. I was in the kitchen making breakfast while the kids sat in the living room, finishing up some weekend cartoons. The knock at the door was sharp and deliberate, the kind of knock that told you the person on the other side wasn't leaving until you answered. I already dreading who it might be. Ignore it, I called to the kids, figuring it was just a delivery or someone selling something. But the knocking didn't stop. When I opened the door, there was Jake, standing there with his usual smug grin. He had that casual, unbothered energy, like he was stopping by a friend's house to hang out, not barging into a situation he had no business being part of. "Hey man," he said, nodding at me. "Figured I'd swing by. Got a minute?" I blinked, trying to process why he was here. "Sarah didn't mention you were coming," I said flatly. Jake shrugged. "Didn't think I needed an invite. She said you guys were still working out the details about me moving in, so I thought I'd stop by and, get a feel for the place." The audacity of this guy was unbelievable. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, keeping my voice level. "We haven't agreed to anything about you moving in." Jake laughed like I'd just told him a joke. "Come on, man. Sarah said it's pretty much a done deal. Just a matter of figuring out the logistics, right?" Before I could even respond, he stepped inside, walking past me into the living room. My youngest looked up from the couch, confused, and my oldest gave me a look that said everything I was already feeling. "What is he doing here?" "Nice setup," Jake said, looking around like he was appraising the place. He plopped down on the couch, stretching out like he owned it. I clenched my fists, trying to keep calm. "Jake, this isn't a good time. You should have called before coming over." Before he could answer, Sarah walked in the front door. She paused for a second when she saw Jake, then broke into a wide, overly cheerful smile. "Oh, Jake, I didn't expect you this early." "Early?" I said, turning to her. "I didn't know he was coming at all." She waved her hand like it was no big deal. "I must have forgotten to mention it. No harm done, right?" I glanced at the kids and told them to head upstairs. Once they were out of earshot, I turned back to Sarah and Jake. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight. "Jake just told me he's here to check out the house because you've been talking about him moving in." Sarah's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Babe," she said, stepping closer to me, "I was just trying to help. Jake's in a tough spot, and I thought if he could see how we might make it work, you'd be more open to the idea." "We've already talked about this," I said, my patience wearing thin. "I told you I'm not comfortable with it." Jake, still sprawled out on the couch, decided to chime in. "Relax, man. It's not like I'm asking for much. Just a bed and some space to breathe. You won't even notice I'm here." I turned to him, my tone cold. "This isn't your decision to make, Jake, and it's not happening." Jake scoffed and stood up saying, All right. No need to get worked up. I'll leave you two to sort it out." He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, muttering something under his breath. As soon as he was gone, I turned to Sarah. "What the hell was that?" "What do you mean?" she snapped. "Jake's my family. He needs help, and I'm trying to find a solution. You're the one making this harder than it has to be." "I'm making it harder," I said, my voice rising. "You've been going behind my back, making decisions for my house, my kids, and my family. How is that okay?" Sarah crossed her arms, glaring at me. "You're being impossible. Jake is family, and family helps each other. Why can't you see that?" "Because this isn't just about Jake," I said. "This is about you trying to push my kids out of their home to make room for it. They've already been through enough. I'm not uprooting their lives to make things easier for you or your brother." Her face twisted with frustration. "You're so stubborn," she spat. "Do you even care about how hard this is for me? I'm trying to build a future with you, and you're too busy clinging to your perfect little setup to see that." "This perfect little setup is my kid's life," I shot back. "And I'm not going to apologize for protecting it. If you can't understand that, then maybe you're not ready to be part of this family." Her expression hardened, and I knew what was coming before she even said it. "Fine," she said coldly. "If you're not willing to compromise, then maybe we need to rethink this whole thing." I stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. Then I took a deep breath and looked her in the eye. "You're right," I said. "We do need to rethink this. And I've made my decision." Her face flickered with something, shock, maybe anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm choosing my kids," I said firmly. "They come first. Always. If you can't accept that, then we don't have a future together." The silence that followed was deafening. She stared at me like she couldn't believe what I'd just said, but I didn't back down. "Is that it then?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I said. "That's it." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the living room, speechless. Walking away from Sarah that day, I felt a strange mix of emotion. There was relief, knowing I'd stood my ground and chosen my kids, but there was also a heaviness in my chest. This wasn't just the end of an argument. It was the end of everything we'd been building toward. I knew the breakup was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier. Sarah didn't take it well. For the first day or two after I told her it was over, she didn't say much. She avoided me, barely acknowledging my presence when she came by to grab a few things she'd left at the house. I thought maybe she was processing it all, but then the storm hit. It started with the wedding. Sarah called me one evening, her tone cold and businesslike. "So, I assume you're canceling everything?" she asked. "Yes," I said, keeping my response short. "There's no reason to keep the plans going." Her response was immediate. Good. Then we need to talk about the money. I frowned. What money? The deposits, she snapped. I've already put down a deposit on the caterer, and I expect you to reimburse me since you're the one canceling. It's only fair. I paused for a moment, realizing that her demands would never stop, even when we're breaking up. Sarah, I already paid for the venue deposit, which was more than what you spent on the caterer, I said. That's not the point, she said sharply. You're the one who decided to end this, so you should take responsibility for the financial fallout. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I'm not reimbursing you for anything, Sarah. We both contributed to this wedding, and we both knew the risks of non-refundable deposits. You made your choices, and I made mine. This is on both of us. She didn't like that answer. So what? You're just going to leave me out of pocket for hundreds of dollars? I'm already out of pocket for thousands, I said, my voice firm. The venue, the invitations, the flowers. I covered all of that. I'm not paying for more just because you want to pass the blame. The conversation went nowhere. She kept insisting that I was being unfair, while I held my ground. Eventually, she hung up on me, but the calls didn't stop. Over the next few days, she bombarded me with texts, emails, and voicemails, all demanding that I pay her back for the caterer. At one point, she even threatened to take me to small claims court if I didn't comply. It wasn't just about the money, though. Sarah wasn't content to leave things between us on a simple financial dispute. She started spreading her version of the story to mutual friends and family, painting me as the bad guy who abandoned her and refused to help her struggling brother. I got calls from people I hadn't spoken to in months, asking me what was going on and why I was being so cruel. One of her relatives, a distant cousin I'd only met once, actually had the nerve to lecture me about family values. Jake's going through a tough time, she said. You could have made a small sacrifice to help him out. It's not like you'd be homeless. I bit my tongue, not wanting to argue with someone who clearly didn't understand the full story. But it stung. No one seemed to care about my kids, or how Sarah's demands would have turned their lives upside down. All they cared about was her version of events, where I was the heartless villain refusing to help. Thankfully, I had my own circle of support. My close friends and a few relatives knew the truth and backed me up without hesitation. You did the right thing, one of my friends told me. Anyone who tries to push your kids out of their home doesn't deserve to be part of your life. Still, the fallout was exhausting. Canceling the wedding was a logistical nightmare. I had to contact vendors, explain the situation without airing too much dirty laundry, and navigate the awkwardness of calling off an event that people had already marked on their calendar. Most people were understanding, but a few tried to pry for more details. I kept my responses vague, saying it was a mutual decision and that we'd realized we weren't on the same page about the future. Through it all, my kids didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but they could tell something had changed. My oldest asked me one night, "Are we not having a stepmom anymore?" I smiled gently and shook my head. No, we're not. But you know what? That's okay. We're still a family and nothing is going to change that. They seemed relieved, which only reinforced that I'd made the right decision. The thought of them being shipped off to some boarding school while Jake moved into their rooms still made my blood boil. Sarah had completely underestimated how much I valued my role as a dad, and that was her biggest mistake. The final straw came a week later when Sarah showed up unannounced to grab more of her things. She walked into the house like she still had some claim to it, her eyes scanning the place as if she were checking for signs of her absence. She didn't say much at first, just packed her stuff in silence while I stayed in the kitchen, giving her space. But as she was leaving, she stopped in the doorway and turned to me. "You know," she said, her voice icy, "you'll regret this. You had a chance to build something better, and you threw it away." I met her gaze, calm but firm. "No, Sarah. I didn't throw anything away. I protected what mattered most, my kids and their home. If you can't understand that, then this was never going to work." Her expression flickered for a moment, like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Finally, she scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and walked out the door for the last time. The house feels quieter now. Honestly, this wasn't the future I'd pictured when I proposed to Sarah. But maybe that's for the best. My kids are safe, their home is still their sanctuary, and I'm free from the chaos she tried to bring into our lives. But I can't help wondering, was there something I missed early on that could have prevented all this? I'm still processing everything, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and advice. I'll update if anything significant happens. Thanks for reading, Reddit. Final update. Hey again. So I thought the breaking up and canceling the wedding would be the end of the drama. I couldn't have been more wrong. Turns out, walking away from Sarah wasn't just about protecting my kids and keeping our home intact. It also meant dealing with a wave of chaos I didn't see coming. From Sarah spreading lies about me to her brother Jake making veiled threats, things went from tense to downright absurd. You know that she already tried to victimize herself in front of our families. Still, she leveled up. She told mutual friends and some of my family members that I was abusive and controlling. spinning the story in a way that made her the victim. Suddenly, I was getting calls and messages from people asking me to explain myself. Some were sympathetic, while others outright accused me of being the kind of person who'd push someone to their breaking point. One mutual friend, let's call him Dave, actually called me up to say, "Hey man, I heard you made Sarah's life hell. What's going on?" I had to take a deep breath before responding. "Dave, do you honestly think I'd do that? She wanted me to send my kids to boarding school so her brother could move in. That's the reality." Thankfully, Dave was reasonable enough to hear me out, and after I told him the full story, he backed off. But not everyone was as understanding. Sarah had a way of twisting things. She was always good at playing the victim. Jake, of course, wasn't any better. A week after the breakup, he texted me out of the blue. His message read, "You're a spineless coward for not helping your family. I might swing by to get what's mine. Better hope I don't have to force it." The entitlement was mind-blowing. I hadn't taken anything from Jake. In fact, the only thing I'd done was refuse to let him bulldoze his way into my home. But his text wasn't just infuriating, it was unsettling. I wasn't going to take any chances, so I called a locksmith the next day to change the locks on every door. For a few days, I kept expecting Jake to show up again, pounding on the door or causing a scene. But instead, everything went strangely quiet. It wasn't until later that I found out why. A mutual friend told me that Jake had been caught stealing money from Sarah. Apparently, during one of his drunken episodes, he'd managed to access her bank account and drained it dry. We're not talking about pocket change either. He wiped out thousands. When I heard the news, I wasn't even surprised. It was almost inevitable. Jake had been a leech for as long as I'd known him, always expecting someone else to clean up his messes. But this time, he'd gone too far, even by his own standard. What made it worse was that after stealing her money, Jake completely disappeared. He wasn't answering calls or texts, and no one had seen him in days. Sarah was left scrambling, not only to figure out how to pay her bills, but also to deal with the debt he'd saddled her with. Then, as if things couldn't get any more ridiculous, Sarah showed up at my house. She didn't call or text beforehand. She just appeared on my doorstep, looking like she hadn't slept in days. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, she launched into her sob story. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "Jake stole everything. I don't know what to do." I stood there for a moment, processing what she'd just said. I got flashbacks of everything she'd put me and my kids through, and any sympathy I might have had disappeared. "Sarah," I said firm, "this isn't my problem. You made your choice. You wanted Jake to move in here, remember? You put him above everything else, including my kids. Now you're dealing with the consequences." Her expression shifted from pleading to angry in an instant. "How can you be so heartless?" she snapped. "I thought you cared about me." "I did," I replied. "But you showed me who you really are. You put your brother's comfort over my kids' stability, and I'm not going to clean up the mess that came from that decision. This is on you." She tried to argue, but I shut her down. "You need to leave," I said, my voice steady. "I'm done with this." She stood there for a moment, clearly stunned. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure. Over the next few weeks, the fallout continued to ripple through Sarah's life. Jake was still nowhere to be found, and her finances were in shambles. Mutual friends started distancing themselves from her as the truth about Jake's actions came to light. The lies she'd told about me didn't hold up under scrutiny, and people began to see the real story. Looking back, I can't say I regret any of it. Not the breakup, not the canceled wedding, and certainly not choosing my kids over Sarah and her chaotic family. It was a tough lesson, but one I'll never forget. The people you let into your life should add to it, not take from it. And if that means shutting the door on someone who doesn't respect your boundaries, so be it. My kids come first, and that's never going to change. Thank you guys for reading.